What's up, guys? So today we are going to be talking about Jeff Nippard's year-long experiment to gain as much muscle as he possibly could as a natural. And I remember specifically thinking that I really hoped that he would cut back down to the same body fat at the end, because that is critical for this to really have any meaning. So we're going to get into that as well as some practical takeaways at the end of the video. So on that first point, super important, and this is what I always say to people: if you are going to be making comparisons, you either have to be looking at the same body fat or the same weight. So what I mean by that is, if you're 200 pounds and then you bulk up and you cut back down, you can go to 200 pounds and then you should hope to be leaner than you were before, but now you've kept weight constant, and now you can see if the body fat is lower through calipers, through pictures, through measurements and things like that. Alternatively, you can get back to the same body fat. So in this example, you're 200 pounds, you bulk up to 220. When you cut back down, maybe now, when you get back down to the same waistline and calipers that you had before, now you're 203 or 204. And so you can say, hey, I'm at the same body fat roughly, and I'm now 3 or 4 pounds heavier. But you have to have some variable that's constant. And so my concern was, if Jeff just bulked up and said, hey guys, look at this, I gained all this strength and I gained muscle mass, and even if I look at a DEXA and ultrasound, I gained muscle, it's really not relevant. And I know Jeff knows that, and I know people who've been in the space for a while know that, but a lot of people, they don't. I've heard people even say, oh, well, what if you just bulked up and you put on 50 pounds on your bench press? You're saying you're not gonna gain any more muscle if you're thinking you're maxed out? To which I would say, no, of course you're going to gain muscle in that situation. And if you bulk up another 50 pounds and you put even more on your bench press, your pecs are gonna grow and you're gonna gain even more muscle. That is not relevant, because that's not the argument. The argument is, can you build more muscle at a given body fat percentage? Not saying you have to stay the same weight the whole time, but when you cut back down, are you going to be a better version? Because anybody can just gain muscle mass. You know, if you look at sumo wrestlers, some of the highest muscle mass out there, and it doesn't really matter because nobody wants to actually look like that, right? So you have to cut back down to a reasonable level to see if there's actually been progress. So in this situation, I really liked how he did it. He bulked up, he had a little bit of a maintenance period, and then he cut back down. And in this situation, he gained a couple pounds of muscle. Now, I think the actual number was maybe 2.7 or roughly 3 pounds of muscle. And that's great. Now, obviously, there's going to be some variability there. And so we have to keep that in mind. Not to say that he didn't actually gain muscle, but just keep in mind that any measurement you use, whether it's calipers or DEXA or ultrasound or anything like that that you're using to measure body fat and whatnot, you are still going to have some variability there and some margin of error that you have to consider. But it looks like from the pictures and the general strength gain that he probably did gain a couple pounds of muscle. And to do so at the same weight is really impressive and really awesome that he was able to do that. What I would caution people against, though, is to then look at this and say, see, people don't actually have a natural max, and once he put even more effort into it, he got more out of it. That, I think, is an incorrect conclusion, and I'll explain why. So for one, we don't know exactly what Jeff was doing in the months or especially years leading up to that. The reality is Jeff has been at this game for a very long time, and so it's very likely that at certain points he had become a little bit more casual with it. He had probably not been 100% dedicated, obviously, because that was the change here, was to become 100% dedicated. So obviously up to that point, there were potentially some things, maybe slightly, that he was slacking on. And so of course, most people, I mean, you look at somebody like a Jeff Alberts has talked about how at certain points he hasn't been as dedicated. It didn't mean that he lost tons of muscle mass, but maybe his body fat went up a little bit, maybe it wasn't as serious, but you could get back to that. For all we know, this is not new muscle mass for Jeff. Now, I don't know, I haven't talked to Jeff in detail at all about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of this is regained muscle. I really don't know enough of his history, but with how long he's been lifting and how seriously he's taken it at times, I'd say it's very unlikely that he was already at the most muscle he's ever had prior to that experiment. He had probably had a little bit more at some point. He probably lost a little bit. And now, how much of this was actually regained muscle? I mean, for all we know, it could be 100% regained. He might have already had this before. I'm sure he had at least some of it, right? I'd say it's very unlikely that right before this experiment, he was already at his peak. That seems very unlikely to me. Additionally, even if he was close to his peak there, it's not as if you can then make the conclusion, and then he's gonna stay at 100% intensity and he's gonna get another few pounds of muscle. That is obviously an incorrect conclusion, and obviously there is still a point where it's going to taper off probably dramatically. In fact, I would guess that if he did this exact same thing for another year, spent another 6 to 9 months bulking up, and then cut back down, he may literally see zero progress at that point. I don't know, maybe it would be 1 pound, which would still be really, really great at this stage of the game, but it may be zero. And that's the thing, is that now you're kind of at this new peak that you have to maintain. This is one of the issues with any sort of sport or any sort of physical endeavor. You know, we recently had Daniel from Fitness FAQs on the channel, and he said, look, I've been doing calisthenics at a high level for almost 2 decades. I think it was like 15 years. And so in that situation, where do you go? You're kind of peaked out. And especially if something like that, where there's any sport where there's a huge skill component, that is the concern, is you're going to get better and better and better. But now to maintain that peak, you might be looking at 7 to 10 hours of effort every single week. And so that's just something to consider. Again, very much so for sports where there's a reason that most athletes peak out in their late 20s or so for the most part, because what is required to maintain that peak is so difficult. With bodybuilding, that's generally not as significant, and you can maintain a peak physique with less effort, but still not like you can just drop down. You know, the people quote the studies and they'll show, oh, well, they maintain muscle mass on 1/3 of the volume. But I don't think these were advanced lifters, and that's certainly not going to apply for everybody. I know somebody like Eric Helms would talk about that if he even cut down to 2/3 of the volume, he would maybe lose significant amounts of muscle mass, significant to him. And so that's just something to keep in mind, is that now that's great that this experiment was done, proof of concept, but are you now going to maintain doing everything 100% all of the time? And you could make the same argument for peaked strength and peaked hypertrophy as well. Probably even more so for peaked strength, where most of us have had a goal at some point, bench press 1-rep maxes, any sort of 1-rep maxes to kind of hit a goal. And then if you're at an intermediate stage, that's great. Now that's kind of like your new general strength level. But any advanced trainee will tell you that when you hit that peaked strength, that's not what you're just walking around at all day, all year being able to do. You know, if I think about my best ever overhead press or my best ever bench, I was generally peaking for these, but now I just have a general strength that could be 10% lower than that, and that's what I can do most of the time. And so I don't know if that concept applies as much to hypertrophy, but it still applies to some degree. And so there is going to be a peaked level, and now you kind of have to keep doing those things or else it's going to drop back a little bit. And again, it's not just going to be this continued increase. You know, I think creatine is a great example here, and an example that I've given for years is that I don't think creatine is increasing exponentially the progress you're going to make. If you're somebody who responds to it, I think you're probably getting an initial bump. But if you had 2 people, I think the one is going to get a little bump and then they're both going to increase. It's not like there's going to be a bump and then one's going to keep going higher and higher. Okay, so I think realistically, you're probably going to get a little bump. And then that's kind of it. And I think if Jeff or anybody else really committed 100% at that stage of the game, then it's probably a bump. And now it's just going to be back to kind of a maintenance if you maintain that level of effort. Now, what should not be taken from what I'm saying is that more effort never really matters, because that's not the case at all. If you are, you and your friend, you're 2 or 3 years into this, and you're saying, hey, I'm going to put everything into this, and this other person's not, and they're just a casual lifter, in that situation, because there is still so much on the bone, now at the end of the day, if that more lackadaisical person is still very consistent, still pushing to failure, still over time putting in the effort, they're probably going to end up in a similar-ish position, but they're going to get there much more slowly, and they may never get to their full potential. In fact, I'd say it's very likely that they will never get to their full potential. But the consistency and the intensity over time is going to be the most important thing. I would also make a note that something I've mentioned many times before is that, I certainly get many more comments about general physique and whatnot when I am bulked up. And that's just because if I'm on Instagram, it's the exact opposite, right? If I'm on Instagram, then I'm going to be getting more comments that are positive when leaner. But in the real world, in person, I just look bigger when I'm fatter. And so the reality is that's when you get most compliments. That is basically probably something that you would see with this Jeff Nippard experiment as well. The difference between him in clothes at the start and at the 9-month mark was probably much more dramatic than him at the start and the 12-month or whenever the diet was done mark. Because now he is just back to being a smaller individual compared to his bulked up state. I think he actually mentioned that his dad complimented that he was looking bigger, but that was after the bulk, right? That his chest was more filled out, something like that. So after being bulked up. And most people who've been lifting for a while will find that. The heavier they get, frankly, up to a certain point, obviously not above like 20% body fat or so, but up to a certain point, you're just gonna look bigger and bigger. And so this is why it's really important to do this sort of thing for you. If you were just doing it for other people's compliments, you could just bulk up to 18%, again, depending on how often you're clothed versus maybe if you live in like Tampa, Florida or something, and you're, shirtless half the time, that might be a different story. So geographic differences and everything would obviously apply. If you're doing this as an influencer where your career is based on how you look with your shirt off, that's a different story. But for most people, they probably are going to look more impressive when they are bulked up. And so that actually happened, I think in Jeff Nippard's case, he probably looked in person more impressive bulked up, and then cut down, he lost a lot of that. If you look at the pictures, if you look at his strength, and you look at the actual measurements that were taken, it seems like he did legitimately gain some muscle mass, which is awesome at that stage of the game. So as far as practical takeaways, I hope this doesn't come across as negative at all towards anything that Jeff did. I think it's awesome that he did the experiment, that he had the time to be able to put into putting 100% effort into something like this. And I think it does show that most people can get more progress in the next 6 months or the next year if they put more effort into it. I am very big on the long game here, and so I will often talk about sustainable approaches. But most people who are in the gym, like just general population, probably do need to be pushing harder. And this really shows that even if you've been at it for a long time, you can still gain more muscle, and it's worth experimenting. It's worth trying some high volume phases. It's worth trying specialization phases. It's very unlikely that you are completely maxed out. You might be close if you've been at this for 10, 15, 20 years, but most people can still get a little bit more. And so this is shown by Jeff, who's already competed as a natural bodybuilder, has obviously been at this for a long time. So I think his message was actually very positive. I think my message here is meant to be positive, but I've also seen some generally incorrect conclusions made from his video, acting as if he can just keep gaining, or naturals have no limit because look at this experiment. So I just wanted to touch on it. So I thought that was very interesting. I hope you enjoyed his experiment. I hope you enjoy the experiments that I do with various diets and training routines and whatnot. If there's anything else you'd like to see me cover, comment down below, subscribe to the channel for more, and I will see you guys next time.